Hi everybody and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller and my guest today is
Andrew Ross.
Lovely to have you here, Prof. And I have a stereotypical query which I pose to all guests, which is to ask what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you. What's going on for the Prof?
Well, these are difficult questions, Toby. I would say remarkably, I find myself at peace with myself, unusually given the state of the world right now and the turbulence and the multiple wars that are being fought, especially in the Middle East, although it does seem like one continuous war initiated by the state of Israel, to me at least. And I suppose still grappling with the analysis of that situation, but we're both here in Guadalajara and visiting my old friend and comrade Toby, so it's one of the reasons I feel at peace.
Buenas tardes.
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estamos?
Buenas tardes.
¿Todo bien?
Bien, todo bien.
Excelente, gracias. Indeed, Prof. And whilst we may talk about numerous other things, an important starting point is this new book. Note, unpaid for product placement. But this isn't accidental product placement. This is a straightforward endorsement, not that any is necessary on my part. Although there is an endorsement by someone named Todd Miller on the back of it, so that's close to me. No, this is called The Weather Report, A Journey Through Unsettled Climates, and it's Andrew's latest book. It has this very striking cover and endorsements from a number of important writers, including Rob Nixon, author of Slow Violence. I think one of the best examples of so-called environmental humanities or naturalist writing around, and really something that's already become a classic, having come out 15 years ago. I mean, for me it was a classic the day it came out, really. But quite apart from that, it's terrific to have a copy of Andrew's
Una
book.
pregunta.
Sí, adelante.
Tú que ya tienes aquí mucho tiempo, me dicen que hay un asador aquí.
Ok.
¿Dónde está?
Estaremos aquí solo por como 40 minutos.
No, sí, pero digo, que existe un asador aquí en esta parte. ¿No sabes? ¿No has visto?
No sé nada de esto.
No, yo
¿Vale?
tampoco veo nada.
Ok.
Pero bueno, ya aquí nos vamos.
Nada, gracias.
Dale.
This, speaking of naturalistic writing or nature writing, this is a naturalistic ethos in this podcast. What happens, happens. So, folks, it's an important book already for me, just like Rob Nixon's Slow Violence was. And Andrew, I'd like to ask you a rather obvious question, which is, how did this come to pass? It's something you explain excellently in the book, but for those who've not yet had the chance to read it, give us the scoop.
It's a fairly straightforward story, Toby. I had a sabbatical and I decided to revisit all of some of the locations where I'd previously written books. These were in Palestine and China, in Arizona, and the UAE. And to interview people and pick up on stories and do some reporting, mostly for myself, but I hadn't really intended to write a book. But writing books is one of the very few things in life that I know how to do, so it turned into a book. It is mostly a book about climate justice, and although it's a contemporary report for the most part, it does dwell on or grapple with the very deep and ongoing legacy of Malthusianism and the relationship between population and the supply of natural resources. I would say that's at the heart of it.
Yeah, I think that's true. There are two things that really struck me about the book, or struck me most about the book. One is your use of the word report, both as a description of what you're doing, and then you talk about various informants and others, X or Y reported. And then the other thing is the interesting tension between the Malthusian obsession with overpopulation, so-called, and ideas of degrowth And related to those two, a tension between whether things should be left to civil society to try to fix, or left to the state to try to fix, or whether there should be a rejigging of the axis of civil society and state. So I wanted to focus on those three things, at least for the moment. To begin with, this question of a report. You use that expression. Now I get it, the weather report is a known expression, but it's more than that for you, isn't it, this notion of report?
You're right. It is a method I call scholarly reporting that I've used in a lot of my books, that is a kind of blend of investigative journalism and field ethnography. So it is people-based reporting that I do, without any short-term deadlines, the way a journalist would have. So I have the luxury of having long-term deadlines, but at the same time I feel driven in the investigative mode to find a story that if it hasn't been told, then it hasn't been told from a certain angle. So that's the kind of method that I've tried to use in a lot of books, and it's become normative for me in a way. It's just the way I operate when I go into the field. So that's the reporting part of it, and each of the chapters in the book does draw upon extensive interviews with selected people, selected populations.
Now, related to that comes a slightly awkward question, an unpleasant question, one that an old friend should not pose to another old friend, even though both parties are in fact old. And that's this question. One of the criticisms of the category foreign correspondent or war reporter is that these are people who, and this is not an accusation I'm making of you, but they speak bravely of themselves in terms of every time they encounter anything dangerous or difficult, we are told about it, we are shown it. It's part of the fetish and part of being there. But the other is they don't know the places that they're writing about, really. And that becomes related also to old-style anthropology, where you found a village leader who spoke a bit of English or a bit of French, whatever it might be. So what about this question of, in a sense, parachuting into places and then departing, and also the question of linguistic challenges, because in the book you're crossing numerous linguistic boundaries, Chinese, Arabic, English. What sorts of issues does that present in the context of old school anthropology and ideas about being a war correspondent or a foreign correspondent versus what are seen as academic norms of today, for example?
Yeah, they're very appropriate questions, Toby, and I think anyone who either does that field ethnography or journalism in locations that are not their own home does agonize, or should agonize, over these kinds of questions. In my defense, I would say that each of these locations I do have a fairly long-term relationship with, sometimes with people in these locations over 10 or 15 years or so. So when I said I revisited them, it wasn't for the first time. I have been revisiting these places and tried to keep up with the changes. But the second thing I would say is that I really do try to rely almost wholly on what I hear from people who are resident in these locations. My aim is not really to draw my own analyses, although sometimes that's unavoidable. But for the most part, I'm trying to align myself and as it were, amplify what I'm finding on the ground. So again, that's something one agonizes over, but it's become normative for me. So it doesn't trouble me the way it might have done at one time.
There is an overshadowing urgency for me in the book, in the different sites, China, the United Arab Emirates,
Palestine.
Arizona,
Yeah.
Palestine, then that is Palestine, and a sort of overarching figure in this of Israel.
Mhm.
Although that said, there is a shadowy figure called the extractive industries that is also responsible right across these sites. Is there a dominant element in this for you of the situation over the time you were reporting
Mhm.
of Gaza in particular?
Yes. The book really begins 6 weeks before October 7th. I was interviewing villagers north of Ramallah about the chronic water shortage in the region. Most households only had water once every 3 weeks. Even in Ramallah, a lot of neighborhoods only once a week. Ramallah has a larger rainfall annually than London, rainy old London, and it sits on top of a vast, abundant aquifer. The Palestinians are forbidden from drilling wells to extract the water. So there isn't a natural condition of water scarcity there. It's entirely artificial, manufactured by the occupier. And Israel delivers a quota of water that was agreed upon in 1994 as part of the Oslo Accords, despite the fact that Palestinian population has increased by over 75% in the interim.
Mm-hmm.
So Israel has its water on a giant tap, and it can turn it on and off at will, which it does for collective punishment or otherwise. And I had to establish that first of all, and also then research the whole history of Israeli efforts, Zionist efforts initially to secure a water supply to guarantee population growth. But I had to establish that in order to, fend off the sort of default assumption, I think, on the part of many people who are aware of the climate crisis, that insufficient water is a symptom of climate stress, especially in the Middle East. It's very arid, fast-growing population. But yeah, if you drill down, the problem is not one of ultimate scarcity. It is usually always one of uneven distribution.
And allocation of resources, who gets to control them, and as you say, uneven
Exactly.
distribution.
Exactly. So water is one of the big themes,
Mm.
and it runs entirely through the Arizona chapter, of course, because perennial fears about water scarcity are omnipresent there. But energy is the other one, and my chapter about the UAE, I was attending the climate summit in 2023, COP28.
Mm-hmm. Conference of the Parties.
Yes, and I was able to see at close hand the cynical management of climate diplomacy on the part of the big fossil fuel producers,
Mm-hmm.
how they tout their domestic policies that are net zero carbon policies on the one hand. On the other hand, they're stepping up their extraction of hydrocarbon sources to sell, to export to poor countries that can't afford renewable technologies. Every fossil producer of note does this. Even, in our mind, we think of progressive countries like Norway and Brazil. They pursue the same dual-track energy policy. And I hadn't fully grasped that until I attended the climate summit. I hadn't been at one of those before, so it was well worth a visit. I was able to come away with that knowledge, let's say, and write about it.
And that, I think, leads into one of my queries that I referred to earlier, namely this relationship between state and civil society. Because if you weren't cynical about states before you went to COP28, it sounds like experience there would have turned the most Pollyanna-ish analyst of such things against the notion that one can trust democratic governments.
Mm-hmm. Well, that I fully agree with that. Maybe one statistic might help to illustrate that. When we think about, public ownership of resources, we tend to think that that's a progressive thing. But looking at fossil fuel, you come away with exactly the opposite impression. 75% of the world's hydrocarbon reserves are owned and are being extracted by publicly owned oil companies.
Right.
In many of these countries, including this one, I believe, You have a publicly owned oil company that is in that business and they're all increasing their rate of extraction. And this was before Trump, and would be happening without Trump.
Without him, yeah.
And though it's certainly true that he is amplifying the problem.
One of the things that makes Mexico different from a lot of places, and one could argue that things are similar in Norway in particular, is that the structure of feeling of the society is deeply encrusted with a sense of the importance of that industry. In the case of Norway, because ordinary people benefit so extensively from it, rather like people in Alaska do.
And in the Gulf
more
States.
spectacularly. Yes, but it's
Native
not,
born.
It's right, but it's got to be, it's evenly distributed in Norway, it's evenly distributed in Mexico, at least formally so. And also because the takeover from foreigners was funded by public subscription here in Mexico, right? So, you know, people selling their chicken run and their chickens in order to raise money to give to the government to conduct the takeover. And so that means that over many generations, across 9 decades, people have a sense of connectedness to this that's very powerful. So the irony is there's a lot of civil society history behind state power in this case. So one of the interesting things in terms of, for example, environmental non-government organizations, third sector civil society here, is that rather than denouncing the industry, which would be tactically ill-advised, they say, let's look at these other options. Look at how much wind there is, look at how much sun there is, and aren't these going to be important industries for us to consider? So the positive rather than the negative side of the ledger, if you know what I mean? So this is not to correct what you're saying, it's just to say there are some interesting differences as well as similarities there.
Yeah.
And one key thing that you focus on in all your studies is class/ethnic bias or separateness in terms of who gets the goodies. Could you talk a bit about that? You gave us a couple of examples from Israel, but I think it's important in terms of the migrant workforce in the UAE, for example, and important in China and in Arizona, but in subtly different ways.
Yes, well, with respect to your first comments, there's a portion of the book in which I dwell upon my own past employment history in the oil industry. In the North Sea, where I grew up in Scotland, and at the time, the discovery of oil in the North Sea, as in other countries, gave rise to a wave of optimism about petro-nationalism, and this is ultimately a precarious path to pursue, and this is what many South American countries are experiencing also. In retrospect, I realized that, and this is in my recounting of my experience on these oil rigs in the middle of the North Sea, buffeted by wind and waves, 60-foot waves, and so on and so forth, that the energy we were extracting, the fossil fuel we were extracting, was not the future. In many ways, it was the wind and the waves that were harrying us as we were
that
trying
had the
to
real
do our
energy.
job. Yes, and Scotland is a country that does have that so far untapped energy potential for wave energy and wind energy that could in fact supply, most of Europe, and that is a future in many ways. So that was my own personal account of a relationship to that topic. With regard to your second question, I think if you look at the indigenous experience and indigenous communities and their relationship to natural resources, you do end up with a slightly different angle. In Arizona, for example, indigenous tribes in Arizona have emerged as major water brokers in the Southwest and in the West generally. In the Colorado Basin, the lower Colorado Basin, they've always had senior water rights as a result of treaties, but haven't been able to realize those rights effectively until recently. But they've now emerged as major players at the table in the position of brokering the distribution of water, which is a vital topic in the Southwest, and they come at it not from a purely transactional point of view. They bring spiritual and cultural values to bear upon the discussion, which are not the preserve and not the prerogative of the traditional water brokers. So it's very interesting to see that develop. And again, that's quite a different angle than the normative one.
But in terms of classes of person who are better versus worse treated, the UAE is surely an instance where the, in inverted commas, indigenous population does pretty well and the immigrant population does not.
This is true. And I have a long history of doing research on migrant worker conditions in Abu Dhabi in particular, but the Gulf states generally. And the workers there very much are the canaries in the coal mine in terms of heat stress and the future of laboring outdoors, not just outdoors, but indoors in many contexts under rapidly increasing heat. Their treatment in response to that, and the growing labor movement that revolves around protection for them. For the most part, I think the reporting about migrant workers in the Gulf have focused on their lack of rights of any kinds, but it's heat stress in particular, certainly since the World Cup, the spotlight on conditions in Qatar. So in each of the chapters, I try to focus on movements or tendencies or initiatives that are not they're not pessimistic, they're not particularly grim, that do offer some kind of hope going forward, as it were. And in the UAE, that's one of the examples I do look at. And many of the trade unionists who attended the COP summit in 2023 had that foremost in their minds.
And you turn to this at the end of the book in particular, where you don't want to be too pessimistic, despite some of the pictures that you've painted. And for me, this becomes very interesting in terms of the academic tension between Marxist political economy and cultural studies so often. Where Marxist political economy is good at focusing on structures of domination, slabs of power and how they're exercised, and cultural studies is good at acknowledging points of resistance, of difference and so on. The problem being that the political economy misses out on the actual experience of things like labor, because it's so focused so tightly on hierarchies, on owners, on states and so on, that it forgets about the fact that there is a conflict basis to social relations, a conflictual one, not one of total domination most of the time. Conversely, too much of cultural studies on this rendering misses out on structural determinations of power and makes too much of moments of resistance, right? I mean, that sort of tension, and I think it's fair to say you've walked that line and brought elements of both to your work without one ever becoming dominant. I think that's one of the key things in this book, and especially, although you don't describe it in those terms, because you're not just trying to be an academic satisfying debating norms.
But I'm happy that you are doing so.
It's a dirty job that no one needs to do, but if some poor bastard's going to do it, it might as well not be you, right? But the point is, at the end, when you're talking again about hope, you quote Rebecca Solnit, for example. This becomes quite important, and that's where art, struggle, connectedness, collectiveness, and a sort of reasoned expectation based on history, it seems to me, becomes crucial to the book. Yeah?
Yes, it's interesting you should put it that way. I would not disagree with it. It's and I do think it's highlighted because the context is climate justice, which deals with existential things, right? The continuance of planetary life, the cessation of access to water supplies, which is existential, and so on and so forth. So and there's certainly plenty to be pessimistic about. I think it's all the more important for us to be pushing back against our climate despair and doom and melancholia, which is a diagnosable condition these days.
People
or
talk about this in terms of
psychiatrists.
psychology.
Yeah,
You mention this in the
they do.
book,
They
right? The
do.
sort of depression, and especially amongst young people, it's often seen.
Yes, with good reason.
Yep,
I mean,
yep.
perfectly understandable. But the fact is that while a lot of features of the future are already baked in because of atmospheric carbon buildup, how we live and thrive and survive on that radically altered biophysical landscape is still an open question. Has to be an open political question. We know what the worst case scenarios look like, you know, starker versions of the eco-apartheid conditions that already exist. But the less grim alternatives are not so difficult to imagine. I mean, we could spend the next hour discussing and consenting on a list of perfectly realizable features of a desirable green society.
Mm.
I mean, there are a few more utopian features we might not agree on, but it's very important to keep on dreaming about those. And in the end, I think I think it's in the wake of my travels in China, which really focused on the population crisis in China with one of the lowest fertility levels in the world, fertility rates in the world, where the state is putting a lot of pressure on younger women to reproduce, and they're not responding very warmly. So I interview a lot of young women in Shanghai about precisely that, their responses. But then my youngest daughter, who was adopted in China,
And went with you on this trip.
she came to visit.
Yeah,
She
yeah.
decided we want to go and visit the orphanage.
Yeah.
And I recount our travels in the course of the chapter. We're very warmly welcomed. Of course, the orphanage was full of elderly people, retirees now. There's no more babies being produced. But the right to reproduce in China, which has been such a fraught topic all through the one-child policy, and now a complete reversal, really brought to bear upon me, and especially because my daughter is part of that story. What is essential about thinking about the future in terms of intergenerational heritage? I mean, I know there's a lot of cliched thinking about the storms of our grandchildren, to use James Hansen's phrase, and that we have to be taking climate action for our descendants. But the act of having children and also teaching young people, as we've done all our lives, means that we have to be thinking about the future because they are the future. I mean, in very simplistic terms. And you have to have a blueprint for a future society if you have that relationship with young people, I think. So that's where I kind of end up, in a very existential way in the book.
Yes, and you quote James Hansen a couple of times, former NASA scientist, and really the person who blew the whistle on these issues before Congress in the late 80s. Yeah. One of the points you make about China is the opposite of what Anthony Giddens, whom I do not love to quote, said about the United States. Anthony Giddens said the United States is the only society in world history that has too much civil society. Ho, ho, ho. But
that would be India, I think.
well, perhaps when he was writing it was true. But with reference to China, you do say there isn't enough. There barely is civil society in the sense of thriving third sector organizations, right? So this is one of the cases where, because of a Leninist style of centralized state/party power, it's very hard to see how organized civil society can do terribly much. In the case of Palestine, it's sort of organized international civil society as well as intranational civil society that's needed. In the case of the UAE, the same, right? This blend of international civil society and local civil society. What about Arizona?
Oh, well, there's so many pathologies that converge in Arizona. And I was doing my reporting there in the year leading up to Trump's re-election, when right-wing hysteria about border crossing was at its height.
Yeah.
And I was able to see the convergence between the perpetual fears about water scarcity and these fears about climate. They're not thought of as climate refugees, but they are in my book. The border crossers, and a lot of the right-wing hysterics were articulating some fashion of eco-fascism, in which immigrants were seen as generating pollution, maybe pollutants themselves, and we have to close the borders, the white nationalists tell us, because these foreigners, with their ways, put undue pressure on scarce resources.
Yeah.
That is all very much bubbling under and is on the surface in a lot of debates within Arizona. And I made a lot of trips to the border wall in the course of that reporting with Tucson Samaritans and other humanitarian groups. We interviewed border crossers as they were coming over. We gave them food, we gave them clothing. And it's interesting, none of them said they were going to stay in Arizona. They were bound for New York or LA or Chicago. Not one of them said, I'm going to stay in Arizona. So this hysteria about border crossers coming to live among us, especially in border states, is entirely evidence-free, but informed, as I point out in the book, by this long and deep legacy of Malthusianism, this fear that there's not enough to go around, which is it's a fear that's fed by a primal river of mental dread inside our skulls. There's not enough to go around because there's too many people.
The depressive pastor of centuries ago has actually entered our minds.
Absolutely.
And will not be shut out. And if you think about a lot of the ecological movement in the 60s and 70s, not in terms of civil society or science, but in terms of popular books, they were all about that. The population bomb is one that you talk about.
Yes.
Yeah?
It was really the third wave. I mean, the three waves of Malthusianism that I diagnosed were the social Darwinists in the late 19th century, the eugenicists in the early 20th century, and then this group of ecologists like the Ehrlichs and Garrett Hardin and William Vogt and Lester Brown, who for whom the surplus fertility of brown people in the global south was the big problem. Who will feed China was Lester Brown.
And this is 20 years ago, right, or so, that he wrote this.
And now the equivalent books are, Will China Save the Planet?
It's interesting for me, China is where Japan was in the United States imaginary 25 to 35 years ago. Here is this economic miracle, we can't understand it, perhaps we should be more like it, but then we don't want to be. And all that kind of notion of being taken over in terms of the Seattle Mariners baseball team, Columbia Studios in Hollywood. They're here to take what we're good at. They've destroyed the car industry. So much of that vitriol aimed at Japan is now aimed at China. The difference is that, of course, Japan was just entering its negative growth decade, or 3 decades now.
Yes.
And despite lots of ambivalence about official statistics from China, it's not clear that that is going to happen anytime soon. And it also represents an important counterexample to all the neoclassical economic shibboleths about financial success, about growth, and so on, despite this issue with the substitution rate that you mentioned. So it is a fascinating counterexample.
Yes, it is, but in particular complicated by the undeniable role that China is playing in, generating renewable technologies and implementing them. The world leader by many degrees. The issue, however, is if China's GDP growth is slowing down, it's not moving in the society as a whole is not moving in the direction of degrowth, which is a different thing entirely, a different beast from reduced GDP growth. And trying in many ways, the Chinese example is probably the best example of the Green New Deal in a way. State investments in renewable technology, being able to ease the transition towards a greener society without sacrificing a standard of living. The degrowth, the alternative and competing paradigm, is one in which it's organized around the commons rather than the public power for the Green New Deal, the commons for degrowth, and the restructuring of consumer society around self-organization and self-management of resources and so on and so forth. So I find that socialists tend to line up behind the Green New Deal and anarchists tend to line up behind degrowth, and I feel there's a lot of energy that's wasted in competition between those paradigms. I end up in the book favoring a more of a hybrid version of the public commons model, as it's sometimes termed, where you don't give up on electing political representatives who are progressive and who are then in a position to leverage public power, but to hand over responsibility for the provision and production of services and distribution of goods to the commons, as it were, to self-organized and self-managed collectives. And that is, on a small scale, it's a model that's being tried out in various parts of the world. And in New York City, I wish it were the case that our new socialist, anti-Zionist mayor would adopt something like that. There is a potential for some of that, and if that happened, here I'm thinking about my home ground here. New York would be able to export a positive urban model, whereas spent the last 40, 50 years exporting terrible models of urbanism, from austerity politics to zero tolerance policing to
broken window theory, all this
stop and frisk, and so on.
Just horrible,
Yeah.
horrible.
Yeah.
I remember when the then mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, was making consulting tours in Latin America with his gang of thieves, sprouting this nonsense. And so many civic leaders here just lapping it up and saying, isn't it wonderful? And I said, have you talked to the population of New York City, or have you lived there? Because let me tell you, you're importing a nightmare.
Yes. Yeah.
So, in any event,
Well,
on this issue of the magic elixir of combining state purpose, purposiveness, constitutional authority, economic power, legislative power, with a devolved model that hands over more responsibility and authority and so on to civil society. How does that work in practical terms? Who's funding civil society? Who are the workers who agree to do all of this?
Well, that's the end point of my book.
Yeah.
And I sort of arrive at that destination, I feel, organically for myself, and thinking through the different case studies. I would like to think further about that and look for examples of those models being tried out. I know there are some in various parts of the world, but I haven't done that yet. So I can't answer your question with any confidence or certainty. And there's a utopian element to that, of course, as there is with any sort of plateau of thinking. But I do believe it's a viable tendency going forward. I certainly didn't find it in any of the case studies
Places that you went to. In terms of some of the influential thinkers, you've mentioned the influential thinkers on the Malthusian side. An important figure who emerges at different points in the book for you is Murray Bookchin. a name that may not be familiar to all listeners. I wonder if you could run through a little bit his contribution.
Yeah, I was very influenced by Murray Bookchin at one point earlier in my career. It's a very formative influence in the, I guess, the early 1990s, late 80s. Bookchin was really the first, he was anarchist by inclination, but he was an old socialist. He came out of the socialist tradition. And he was really the first major left-wing thinker to really put ecological change and the threats to our ecosystems in the context of civil society initiatives, and think about a Marxist approach from that angle. And he's best known as the advocate for a post-scarcity society, arguing that we have to be in a position of making choices for ourselves rather than have scarcity imposed upon us, because most versions of scarcity are imposed and artificial and manufactured, as in the case of the water crisis I mentioned in Palestine. And ultimately, it's best to do that now rather than wait, because there may come a point, as we know, as we predict in the climate crisis, when these choices will be imposed upon us.
When China will sell us arks to survive floods in. I think you write about that at one point.
That's the premise of one of my favorite films, 2012, a cheesy chocolate blockbuster starring John Cusack that imagined such a scenario. Very popular in China. So. But that's an extrapolation of Bookchin's thinking,
right?
And I guess I do fall upon the degrowth side in that context, because degrowth will happen anyway because of the climate crisis, and is already happening in certain places. And so better to act now and make choices, post-scarcity choices, before we have no choices left.
Now, there are some interesting gender issues here. You've already referred to China's anxiety about the substitution rate, having created that crisis for itself in a way that arguably was part of its economic miracle. And the fact that this centralized desire to tell women, you shouldn't get pregnant, you should get pregnant, etc., is not proving popular, and that there is resistance there too. On the issue of consumption, this is a tough one in wealthy societies. Really expensive, directly extractive, industry-dependent technologies and objects are often purchased by men. Motorboats, so on, right? Certain kinds of luxury car, all the rest of it. But a vast amount of consumption that is more about apparel, for example, and many other items, which is a huge element of consumption, but not just at the luxury end, all the way down the line, is often in the hands of women. And this gets us back to a sort of dilemma when I read Kant, and we're told that consuming is immature, right? And part of his what is the Enlightenment is that one must transcend personal interest, and especially transcend, although he's subtle about this, religion, and not so subtle, consumption, that in order to think about the greater public will. What does one do about those consumption issues of gender? Male power exhibited in certain kinds of machinery, for example, female emphasis on, in inverted commas, softer goods. This is not something you directly address in the book, but gender issues you do address with reference to the birth rate and so on. Any thoughts about that? Or is your answer going to be, yet again, I haven't thought about that yet, which is a perfectly reasonable riposte, I should say.
Well, the issue of consumption, I mean, it does figure in these debates among the Green New Dealers and the degrowthers, because the Green New Dealers point out that any program like degrowth that is going to restructure consumer society and more than likely reduce material standards of living as a result will not be a popular program. whether you are involved in predominantly male consumption of these objects or female consumption of these others, and they're not exclusive categories,
No,
of course.
no.
But so I think we have to take that seriously. I think it's a cogent critique. To some degree, I did touch upon these questions in my interviews with the young women in Shanghai, because they occupy a position that's unprecedented for women in Chinese society traditionally. They are, especially if they're middle class, and they were mostly middle class women that I was interviewing. They have disposable income.
And disposable goods.
They have disposable goods. They have a higher standard of living, and they have a sense of independence, a really achieved sense of independence, where they can choose their mates, and almost all of them reported that the material and supply, the men, potential mates and supply, were really not up to par. And a lot of them were imagining living on their own without husbands and without children, and to some degree realizing a paradigm of freedom that is very difficult, has always been very difficult to attain in societies like China, but almost anywhere for that matter, really. So they were very much aware of their position. It may not be tenable forever, but their position at that moment in history, and they did not want the state coming in and dictating or pressuring them to reproduce. On the other hand, you have the women of Gaza and the women of Palestine in general who are being denied the right to reproduce by the Israeli Defense Forces. Deliberate targeting by bombing of fertility clinics in Gaza, wiping the eradication of entire families from the civil registry in Gaza. This is something that has a long history in the region, because Jewish demographic superiority has been a major part of settler colonialism in Palestine and Israel. And the Palestinian womb was often described by Yasser Arafat as our most powerful weapon or instrument of Palestinian liberation. It's a very sexist or patriarchal view, because it did relegate Palestinian women to being, vessels of reproduction alone. But it's something that generated a threat to this aspiration for Jewish demographic superiority. So taking away the right to reproduce is, again, existential in Palestinian society, but it has a completely different context in China by that same token.
Getting back to the Green New Deal versus this degrowth model, the Green New Deal was something that, at least allegedly, rhetorically, the Biden administration embraced. It's something that, at least rhetorically, the Labour Party in power in Britain endorses. And the person in charge of it is Ed Miliband, son of Ralph and brother of the Prince across the water, David, who runs the International Crisis Group in New York, and who is still the hoped-for figure of the far right in Labour to come back and save them from themselves. But nevertheless, it's a big deal there still, but it's something that is hard to say in US politics right now. The alternative to degrowth, I'm thinking of lots of indigenous philosophies around the world. You've mentioned some important players in that already in Arizona, but you can see that across the cosmovisions of lots of indigenous groups, really in all settler colonies, including places like Mexico, which are not really settler colonies, although they were. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because they had, again, getting back to gender, they had different sex policies, as did the Portuguese, from the ones that the French and the British and so on had. Just very different. They didn't import, in inverted commas, their women. They married and or raped them here, so a different kind of model. But these cosmovisions are very important, ongoing, powerful alternatives that we get from Native Americans, Native Canadians, and the big indigenous populations in other places, plus the Afro-descended populations in many cases. Case of African American environmental philosophy goes back centuries, and so on. How do we get that to be treated seriously? Right? The Green New Deal got treated very seriously by economists, sociologists, political parties, movement people, and capitalists in many cases. Right? The cosmovision is treated seriously by Juliet Shaw or Arturo Escobar, for example, and is not treated very seriously, for instance, by the Mexican government.
Yeah.
Like all indigenous things, it is the case that this is something cultural
Yes.
that we like and is important and is within all of us,
Yeah.
but it is that.
Right.
Well, at least that's my
Yeah.
accounting. So what about this business of how one can get, on the one hand, local autonomous civic groups that you've spoken of, embracing these cosmovisions that are older than these other philosophies, but are also things that develop and change, and also elites to begin to embrace this stuff? Because it does seem to me that's part of what has to happen if the current opposition, Green New Deal and degrowth, can be somehow or other turned into a coupling, a nice dialectic.
It's such an important question, Toby. Such a big one. I would say, probably the best examples in terms of established or embedded politics in South American Andean societies is the rights of nature, which have been, enshrined in the constitutions of countries like Bolivia and Ecuador. And there are other more local examples in other parts of the world. Rivers have been designated as having rights and so on and so forth. I speculate in the book about whether that would apply to fossil fuels. Does oil have the right not to be extracted, for example? But I feel that, I feel that part of the problem with liberal societies is that we, in liberal societies, we depend so much on the rights tradition. The Bill of Rights in the U.S. is the fundamental anchor of a liberal society. Imagine what the society would look like if there was a Bill of Responsibilities as opposed to a Bill of Rights. Because, rights are essentially, for individuals, it's a version of possessive individualism and the rights that bear upon that. Responsibilities are about what we owe to each other and our obligations to each other and to the ecosystems within which we thrive. That, to me, is a speculative alternative. It's not something elites would respond very well to, because I believe that elites, rather than being in climate denial, let's go back to the Club of Rome report in the early 1970s, which was the Limits to Growth report, which received a lot of attention and was written for elites. And I think the given wisdom is that that elites have been in denial about that. My sense is that they got the message, and they responded in a very rational way by squirreling away resources and hoarding resources and raiding the Commonwealth and instituting government policies that redistributed resources and power and wealth. So they're responding very rationally.
So this, I should just
They
jump
say
in.
they got the writing on the wall.
For people who were not, as we were, teenagers when that came out, the Club of Rome is not a hotbed of Marxist radicalism.
Not at all.
It was absolutely the opposite.
Yes, and it was that was one of the reasons why the report got such an airing, a public airing.
Huge,
Yes.
huge.
And the modeling that was done, it was sort of early primitive computer modeling that produced the report, the estimates of the limits to growth. It's been done several times since then and come up with basically the same kind of scenarios. So I think the secessionist response on the part of elites is perfectly rational. It's not an irrational denial about the facts or climate change. They know the writing's on the wall.
I wanted to give one more personal anecdote, if I could, Prof, which also to a certain extent interpolates you, but then conclude matters by having you add anything you wish. Not that I want to grow the podcast, because it must be limited, of course, but to give you the chance either to revisit terrain we've touched on because you want to offer additional remarks, or touch on something that I've failed to ask you about. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to a specific close?
Yeah, sure.
So my little anecdote is going back actually to the Club of Rome and to the period immediately before you were working on the oil rigs. This is when you and I were teenagers in different parts of Britain, and life was just fucked. When I was studying for my O-levels, which are a sort of public exam that you take potentially if you're 15 or 16, that essentially decide whether you're going to go on to university study preliminaries in the last 2 years of high school. Fair to say? I was studying because it was dark in Britain by, or even in London at 2 or 3 in the afternoon in winter. We had to study by gaslight. I'm sure you had to study by gaslight too, because there wasn't electricity allowed. It was rationed. This was the 3-day week when the whole of industry slowed down, when there was a World Cup upcoming, and there was an issue about whether there would be television available to watch the World Cup, because television ended at night early.
That was the World Cup that Scotland qualified for. Last time.
One of several. But these things really turned what purportedly were secure first world post-war economies that had gone beyond scarcity, at least for the middle class, in the period after the suffering of the Second World War and then rationing for 6 or 7 years thereafter. These things were not supposed to happen. Now, they occurred for a variety of reasons, one of which was that the cartels setting oil prices decided to jack them up, but there are lots of other reasons too. And this issue of North Sea oil was invoked, I would say, several times a day in the bourgeois media as our salvation. Does that ring a bell with you at all, Andrew?
Yes, it does. The one thing I would add to the picture you summoned up is that it was also a time when global cooling was the dominant paradigm. A long series of very harsh winters in Western Europe and North America had precipitated this theory that the new ice age was about to restart, and that the interglacial period of the Holocene, in which humans had thrived as a species, was about to end. And when I teach environmental studies courses, I always have students read CIA commissioned reports about the consequences of global cooling for the U.S. interest. And they're very interesting to read, especially in comparison with the more recent ones that have been, the CIA commissioned reports in response to global heating, global warming. But they come up with the same kind of conclusion, which is fear-mongering about the hungry populations of the world that will pose a threat to resource islands in the north, especially in the U.S., and how geopolitics will have to be recalibrated to respond to those demands from the global south. Exactly the same conclusion, but in response to global cooling instead of global warming.
And of course, a decade and a half later, they're saying that the future struggles around the world will be over water.
Yeah.
This is the sort of post-Cold War anxiety.
Right, no longer food.
Yeah.
No longer food, and in general, I steer clear of food in the book because food scarcity and famines. I think it's sort of fairly well established that these are a result of market dynamics and uneven distribution and so on.
And having a free media. You quote Amartya Sen, who shows that the terrible experiences of famine in India in the 40s prior to liberation are to do with the British not allowing market signals to flow across the country, because it's generally the case in large places that there is abundancy in place A and scarcity in place B, and so you reallocate stuff from one to the other. It's not hard to do,
Right.
but to be able to achieve that, you have to have a free flow of information. I mean, this is his great argument about the economic efficiency of a free press, right? As opposed to the
Yes.
British in India.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So now that I've given my little lectures about why I didn't get my geography O level on geography of the Southwest and lignite in the then East Germany, and I could speak about other failures, but we haven't got enough time. Are there things, Prof, that you would like to add? As I said, this might take the form of something that we haven't touched on, or it might be that you wish to consider terrain where we have done some coverage. What's the latest weather report?
Well, I did mention, and this is actually touches on food. It's the only part of the book that really does touch on food in a way. I mentioned that I tried to, in each of the case studies, to report or to highlight something that was positive initiative. And the one that I found in Palestine, and it was very difficult to find a silver lining in Palestine, quite frankly. I mean, for obvious reasons. The one I found in Palestine was the growth of agricultural cooperatives in the West Bank, of which there are many at this point. And the context for this was a return to the land after October 7th. Israel rescinded the work permits of about 200,000 Palestinian workers who crossed the Green Line to work in Israel and earned what was a living or middle class wage for Palestinian households. They were unemployed, they had no source of income, and many of them returned to their family lands, which had not been lucrative to work on in comparison to going to Israel and earning a wage in construction. So there was this return to the land, and for recently graduated young people, they threw themselves into what they call resistance farming. It's driven by principles of food sovereignty and sustainable agriculture. And I visited a lot of the cooperatives and got a sense of the knowledge that they were reclaiming from traditional agricultural practices, but also innovating, given access to new technologies or new knowledge from other parts of the world. And they were being harried and attacked by settlers, because most of these cooperatives are in Area C. The settlers are particularly active. But I just had such enormous respect for what they were doing, and the underlying principle that a people that cannot feed themselves cannot liberate themselves. And they were providing an example, however small, however micro in nature, of producing local food and produce as an alternative to what most people have to buy in the West Bank, which is monocultural crop produce from Israel that is sold in the supermarkets at Israeli prices. It was a very visible and formidable alternative to that. The future of the movement, of course, is always in doubt, like most things and most such initiatives in Palestine. It was not being funded or supported by the Palestinian Authority. It was a pretty independent kind of movement. But that was the silver lining that I decided to report on.
And it's always important to bear those things in mind in a realistic frame, as you've given us, but one in which the gloom and despair, and you use words like doom a fair bit, that are so prevalent when one digs deeply into the political, economic, and cultural fabric of inequality and brutality, that there is always resistance, there is always conflict, there are always alternatives. And I think that you keep in tension these elements brilliantly in this terrific new book. So thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Toby. It's been a pleasure to converse about it.